Hi, folks. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine and a fellow Unity employee about indie games and sort of making games outside of work. And I wanted to talk about a premise that I've had for a few months now, and I've been doing a little bit of prototyping R&D around this premise. And I wanted to show a little bit of that and talk about it. So this isn't a tutorial. It's not really a demo of a specific game. I'm not going to show my documentation or sort of describe the premise in too much detail because I want to keep this one close to the chest. But so the premise is a simple one, right? This is something that's been done hundreds of thousands of times before in games and movies. So it's not really unique. But I think the uniqueness comes from what is built around the premise and the infrastructure of that premise, inside and around it. And a couple of those things, one of them is going to be lore, right? The backstory, the narrative unfolding of story through the experience and the immersion of that experience. So that's one of the unique things that is very unique to what I would envision this to be made to be. That's really poor English there. And the other one would be the unique rendering aesthetic, right? So taking a unique, non-traditional approach to the authoring side of art content and how that approach will end up with a unique rendering aesthetic at the end of the day in tandem with some post-processing stuff. So I think a couple of those things, they provide that unique proposition on an idea that's been done a bunch, right? So this is horror. That is the genre. This was very specifically chosen. I'm going to go over to my game screen here. Now this screen, we're in the Unity editor here in the LTS, and what we're looking at here, actually I'm just going to pull up the build, I think, if we can find just the build I made of this. This was trying to just set up a little look dev to see what the rendering aesthetic could look like after I went through the art content sort of pipeline with these assets. I'm nowhere near done. I put grass in, I put some trees in, I put some rocks in. There is some volumetric fog and some lighting in here because this takes place at night. Horror game, right? But just to start to validate, I've got to throw a bunch of things in there, some more stuff like some logs and debris. I've got to throw in structures. I've got to throw in characters and things like that and see how they all render. This is a pseudo pixel art effect. So not only is the art content authored in a non-traditional way, but the post-processing on it after the fact with the URP render feature is pixelating everything. So it ends up looking like a pixel art game. So there are multiple layers going on here that will contribute to that unique aesthetic. I think you have to have, right, a hook, right? You have to have some hooks, like at least two or three of them. And if you're going to be working in a genre like horror, where it's already, there's already a bunch of horror games. It's like, so what is your unique value proposition amongst a field of horror games out there already? What are those key points, right? So I think the lore and the narrative of it, as you're in this environment, like how does that unfold? What does that experience look like? Um, uh, so because there are fickle trends that shift in gaming a lot of the time, right? From one year to the next, something's popular, it's not popular the next year. And so you don't want to jump on some kind of trend bandwagon, develop your game for a year and a half, 2 years, and then, that train has gone and left the station, right? So you look for those undertones underneath that just keep repeating themselves from 4 years prior to now to likely being repeated 4 years from now. And one of those is I keep bringing up that lore or the narrative unfolding in context in that world. That thing where people want to believe that they want to feel like that world exists outside of them running the game. Like it is a real place. There are real stakes and there are things that have happened and are going to happen that exist outside of the experience you're having in that moment, the now. I remember back in 1988 playing Super Mario Brothers 3 on my NES, and this exact same thing happened then. I would look at some part of the environment in that world, and a story would form in my mind that that world extended beyond what I could see or play at that moment, right? That was it. I had a light bulb moment thinking about that. And I know many others have had this revelation, and I'm just having it now. But it was the same exact experience 30 years ago or however long ago, and people are craving that today. Anyway, I'm going to look at some of this art content as we talk through this, but my approach to this was not based on having some killer idea and being like the idea guy. It was really based around the marketability and the business aspect of what genre should I work on? How should I approach this from a marketing and business perspective? Like, what is the market demanding out of these popular genres? The horror genre has been popular for years, will continue to have momentum to be popular in the future. But again, what are your unique value propositions in a market that's already sort of crowded, right? So as we look at this rendered scene here, right, obviously a lot of things are in the dark. This is a great genre for sort of hiding, I don't want to say imperfection. When you're dealing with really experienced, senior, seasoned artists, you're just going to get good quality art in general, but it allows you to sort of express what you want to visually without going too far in it. And as an indie who's working alone or potentially with one or two other people, it's super important that you manage the scope of what you want to do. You can't be working on this for 3 or 4 years and let everything pass you by. So the turnaround to some kind of demo or minimum viable product has to be in the terms of months, and your ship product has to be in terms of hopefully less than 2 years, right? We're going to look at a rock here. So we can see there's not a whole lot going on with this rock specifically. And the great thing is the rock reads just as detailed as any kind of nice high-def rock would in the dark in creepy lighting and fog. It is a stylized looking texture based on just a photograph that's tiled, taken into Substance Painter with an algorithmic filter run on it to sort of slope blur that photograph and give it sort of a stylized look to where it no longer has all of that noise grain of a photograph. Sort of the same thing of the tree, though the tree is still a little bit more noisy. The idea here is the detail and all of the color on this rock. One of the interesting things here is if we remove this texture map, if I think I can just zero out this is the rock's, that is the rock's color. The interesting thing, if we look at the texture map on the rock, it's just a grayscale texture. It's really just a detail texture, right? I'm using a stylized shader. It's not mixed in the shader in the same way traditionally. Like we don't have some slots. There is a detail map slot down here I see now looking at this. But so all of the detail, there are some slight hues of yellowish and green and all of that are coming from vertex colors. When I said a non-traditional approach, vertex colors, when you're making like a console game or a high-end desktop PC game, it's not something commonly you're going to see, right? Maybe on a mobile game, maybe on lower end games, but it's a very powerful technique to layer sort of that detail of the diffuse with coloring, right? So when we look here, if I just turn off the diffuse, this is what the rock really sort of looks like. And if I go in here, and I think we can adjust some of the contrast on it, I'm just going to send it to ludicrous levels here so you can see all the different things that are actually married into the color subtly. There's a lot of green and yellows in there for, and they could probably be pushed a little further. But one of the major advantages of this is just this ability to, oops, I flooded it. Bad James. Just to go in here and sort of just touch it up, paint it. It makes the authoring and content, sort of that content creation process super fast. And you can get basically almost an unlimited amount of effects by just putting in different, I mean, we can really push moss in here and grassy. And at the end of the day, when we bring this in, our shader, this is what the rock looks like. It might actually be this rock. The shader is really allowing us to utilize that. I'm looking in here, the vertex colors. If we turn off the vertex colors, it's actually pretty darn ugly. These are what our rocks look like with the vertex colors turned off. So all of that color variation and everything, it's also very performant because all of these rocks get to share the same detail texture. Therefore, they're all sharing the same exact material. Every one of these has the same material, and I can put 100 rocks in here and they're all going to use the same material, but they definitely look uniquely different, and they could look even wildly different. This one's got quite a bit more yellowish green pushed into it. And it's because we can use that vertex data, that vertex color data on these. And so performance is going to be generally a non-issue almost on this. You can afford to push more in geometry because your material shader complexity is lower, and you're able to batch, which is like group together draw calls. That's for another discussion. The post-processing and putting it in the dark really starts to add that different layer on it, really adds that aesthetic. And it might be a little too dark in here. Obviously, you're going to want to give your players some kind of control in the menu to adjust brightness and contrast. But so far, that's the pipeline that I've been sort of working through here for that unique rendering aesthetic. Let's just look at a tree real quick. I wanted to sort of move away from using textures at all. So if we go over here and we look at vertex color, and I just turn off the, what are we looking at here? We turn off, I think it's because that's the tree leaves. We just remove, say, the textures or whatever. This is what our vertex normals and our vertex coloring ends up looking like. It's very subtle on this tree. There are some greens pushed in there a little bit here and there, but again, this was less than 1 day's work on all of these assets. So there's not been a lot of effort or artistic creativity thrown into this. It was really just to validate, can this work? And what will this look like in Unity rendered here in the build? And with a focus on narrative unfolding and lore in an immersive environment like this, I feel like this art style and these assets would totally, there's no reason that they couldn't suit the experience well. So I think those are the two probably key pivotal things here. I'm going to keep moving forward on that whole lore and backstory thing. Like I said, I have a premise. There is a bit of unique story or narrative here. Now, there is a really big divide between having an idea or a premise and then translating that into actionable core gameplay loop and core game mechanics, and then anything unique within those game mechanics. So I have a tremendous amount of unknowns, but I think that this is a good start. And I think if I can flesh out some more of the story, maybe what some of the core gameplay loop would look like, how that could be made more interesting. I think the core gameplay loop, just like the premise, can be simple. I think where your complexity is that layer of, like I said, the unfolding of narrated events and lore and story and interactions with like things in the world, right? Dynamic things in the world that help unfold that lore and that narrative, creatures, artifacts, things like that. So we'll see. I don't want the video to go on too long. There's not a tremendous amount that I'm ready to show 100% yet, but yeah, so this basically the decision or premise for this to try to go down this path and work with something like this wasn't really based around an idea as much as it was marketability and the business, you know, the sort of the market demand, and not just demand in the market, but working in a genre and taking an approach that would be equitable, not equitable, but would facilitate like streamers and influencers to have these experiences that can increase engagement on their end. And when people engage on their end, traditionally, that will trickle down to wish lists and sales on your end. So, I mean, you couldn't make a stronger argument for wanting to cater as much as you can to the way that industry, it works. It is a reciprocal situation there with these influencers and YouTubers, and that has to be considered. Like, I don't want to do this as a hobbyist. I want to do this as a commercially viable product, right? So that has to be something that I consider. Anyway, feel free to add comments at the bottom or give some input or advice or anything like that. Feel free to look up Chris Zukowski on how to market a game. This is where I got a lot of this information about Steam historical data, analytics, historical trends, things like that, and sort of that strongest approach from a business perspective. Anyway, I hope y'all all have a good day, and thanks for watching.